During the Super Bowl, the NFL once again botched the Pat Tillman story. They would mention Tillman died in the line of duty, leaving out so many different aspects to promote the military-industrial complex and absolving the United States of a treacherous cover-up.
Telling Pat's story has always been complicated. In public, he was sold as an unquestioning patriot. In private, he questioned everything, including the war in Iraq.
He would call the war, quote, so effing illegal.
He met his death in April 2004 in the mountains of eastern Afghanistan. At first, the military told the country and Tillman's family that he was killed by enemy fighters as he rushed to protect his comrades from an ambush. Those nearest Tillman when he fell seriously doubted that account.
There were many major players in this story.
War is a war.
Like the architect of the Iraq War, former Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld.
In the case of Corporal Tillman, a Silver Star was recommended.
General Stanley McChrystal, later an Obama-era appointee.
Putting Stanley McChrystal in charge of a commission on military families is a little like putting Bernie Madoff in charge of a commission on pensions.
Former President George W. Bush.
On my orders, coalition forces have begun striking selected targets of military importance to undermine Saddam Hussein's ability to wage war.
And of course, the Tillman family, including Pat's brother Kevin, Pat's mother Mary, and father Pat Tillman Sr. Prior to the Bush administration declaring war in March of 2003, Pat Tillman was already hailed as a hero. He had joined the military after the 9/11 attacks, turning down a 3-year multi-million-dollar deal with the Arizona Cardinals. He and brother Kevin would join the armed forces. Over the years, the NFL's partnership with the United States military has been outlined via a joint oversight report from former Arizona Senators Jeff Flake and John McCain. The $6.8 million Flake and McCain uncovered excludes the $53 million the Department of Defense spent with sports teams on what are considered legit marketing and advertising contracts meant to dupe young kids into enlisting. The Tillman story for both entities was a win-win. Tillman, meanwhile, was a big reader, a history buff, a student of what the U.S. has done previously, even up until that present day. He did not buy into the grandiose of America being this phenomenal superpower and giving into propaganda. That was not who Pat Tillman was. He had loose plans to meet with Massachusetts Institute of Technology linguist and anti-war intellectual Noam Chomsky once he got out of the military. While serving in 2003, he would tell a friend and platoon mate Russell Baer, you know, this war is so effing illegal, and we all said, yeah, that's who he was. He was totally against Bush. The story of Jessica Lynch is another example of many on how the American government will fabricate a story for a positive, harrowing image, and that's via the private's own words. Tillman was in the platoon providing backup to rescue her. The tale told afterward was propaganda. Tillman, an avid journaler, echoed those same sentiments. Pat and Kevin Tillman touched down in Afghanistan on April 8th, 2004. They were halfway through their commitment to the Army. The end was in sight. Then on April 22nd, Tillman was killed. It was a shocking story of great sadness. His memorial service was nationally televised. After his death, the military did not acknowledge how Pat lost his life until 5 weeks after the fact. It was described as a harrowing death, where Pat Tillman risked his life for his platoon mates to eliminate the enemy. Following Pat's passing, the family received troves of files from the Army, all heavily redacted and censored. Most names were deleted. The SF Chronicle's Robert Collier would note, a Chronicle review of more than 2,000 pages of testimony as well as interviews with Pat Tillman's family members and soldiers who served with him found contradictions and inaccuracies in what appears to be the military's attempt at self-protection, including at Tillman's memorial service, where they trotted out a Navy SEAL with printed lines to read, which essentially stated that Tillman died defending his fellow soldiers. John Krakauer, author of Into Thin Air and Into the Wild, which focused on the life and tragic death of Tillman, noted, when a soldier is killed in combat, you should put his uniform, his weapon, everything, anything that can be considered forensic evidence should be sent back to the States with the body, so the medical examiners could determine the cause of death. In the case of Tillman, none of that happened. Tillman's uniform and body armor were burned, he says, and his weapon, helmet, even a part of his brain, which fell to the ground after the attack, disappeared. Army officials told the medical examiners that Tillman had been killed by the Taliban, and they stuck by the story when they reported the death to his family, which raised red flags to many. At the time of Tillman's death, the Bush administration faced heavy scrutiny for the treatment of prisoners at Abu Ghraib.
It was a terrible time for the military and for that administration, and Pat's death was an opportunity for them. In fact, there's a line in it's in the book. It was in the documents that we were given. One of the investigative generals asked someone in the chain of command who was clearly, at a higher rank than the investigative officer, because he kept calling him sir, and the name was redacted. But the general said, "Well, what was the kind of the atmosphere when Pat was killed?" And he said, "Well, it was like, here's the steak dinner, but we're giving it to you on a garbage can cover. You got it, you work it." So in other words, they thought Pat's death was a positive thing for them because they could use it for propaganda. Yeah. Unfortunately, it was a fratricide, so they had to spin it.
As U.S. casualties in the Iraq War hit a record high, the president's approval rating tanked. In Tillman's death, powerful officials saw an opportunity to spin a yarn of heroic sacrifice rather than an obligation to tell the truth. Shortly after the announcement, George Bush called Tillman a hero. After those 5 weeks passed, Special Corporal Brian O'Neill told Congress the following.
Did you have any doubt at that time that it was friendly fire that killed Pat Tillman?
No, sir, I'm 100% positive that was friendly fire.
Many questions were now being raised. Did the United States military cover up the death of Pat Tillman?
But now, testifying at the congressional hearing, that same ranger who was with Tillman when he was killed says his first-hand account was changed and that he was ordered to keep quiet, not even to tell Tillman's brother Kevin, a fellow ranger, the truth.
I wanted right off the bat to let the family know what had happened, especially Kevin, because I worked with him in the platoon, and I knew that him and the family both needed, or all needed, to know what had happened. And I was quite appalled that when I was actually able to speak with Kevin, I was ordered not to tell him what happened, sir.
O'Neill also said it was made clear that if he did tell Kevin what happened to his brother, he would get in trouble.
We'll never have Pat back. But what is so outrageous is this isn't about Pat. This is about what they did to Pat and what they did to a nation.
Many major players would subsequently change their stories. The Army continued providing conflicting and incorrect facts of the day Pat lost his life. The Bush administration clearly was using this case for its own political reasons, said Pat Sr. This cover-up started within minutes of Pat's death, and it started at high levels. This is not something that lower-ranking people in the field do, he would say. Kevin Tillman would say in a hearing, and I quote, "The truth had to be suppressed." Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Kaczmarek, an Army officer tapped to lead one of the early investigations into the incident, was apparently so profoundly unsettled by the Tillmans' lack of religion that he at one point suggested their absence of faith was the reason they couldn't come to terms with Pat's death. Weeks after the memorial service, Kevin Tillman was told by a fellow member of the armed forces how Pat died. Their mother would receive calls requesting comment on what they were hearing and the intel that they were now being given through sources. Reporters brought it to her attention. It would take 4 years of digging, led chiefly by Mary, 7 official investigations, 2 congressional hearings before some semblance of the truth surrounding Tillman's death was pried from the government. More than 2,000 pages of testimony released to the AP in 2007 revealed that Army attorneys sent each other congratulatory emails for keeping criminal investigations at bay, and that the close proximity of the bullet holes in Tillman's forehead had raised serious questions from medical examiners as to the Army's version of events. An alternative narrative had to be constructed, Kevin Tillman would tell lawmakers. So after she would get home from her day job, Mary Tillman would dig and dig and dig because she starved to know the truth of what happened to her son. It would come to light, McChrystal wrote after Pat's passing, quote, "I felt it was essential you receive this information as soon as we detected it, in order to preclude any unknowing statements by our country's leaders which might cause public embarrassment if the circumstances of Corporal Tillman's death became public." Krakauer wrote in his book, McChrystal went to extraordinary lengths to hide how Pat died from the Tillmans. Mary would tell Sports Illustrated they attached themselves to his virtue and then threw him under the bus. They had no regard for him as a person. He'd hate to be used for a lie. I don't care if they put a bullet through my head in the middle of the night. I'm not stopping. So why do I bring this all up?
Marie Tillman says, as a football player and soldier, Pat inspired countless Americans to unify. Pat's service, along with that of every man and woman's service, should never be politicized in a way that divides us. We are too great of a country for that.
Pat's widow, Marie, said it should never be politicized. The NFL did not just invoke Tillman by name leading up to the Super Bowl. 4 U.S. veterans who received scholarships through the foundation named in his honor served as honorary captains. Before the group of Tillman scholars were honored on the field, fans in the stadium and at home were shown a video package during the Super Bowl narrated by Kevin Costner, in which Tillman was presented as nothing more than a patriot and hero for giving up his NFL career to join the U.S. military after 9/11. While certainly his bravery and commitment are worth remembering, Tillman has become a symbol of wayward war and bumbling government's use of the military, their willingness to turn anyone into a pawn, especially after their death when they can't argue with it. This is what the NFL was so eager to play into on Sunday night, wrote Deadspin Sam Fells. Defectors Tom Lee would add, the NFL doesn't give a blank about any of that, though, because the league will never untangle itself from U.S. military's propaganda machine. To do so would be to surrender the idea of watching NFL football as an act of patriotism unto itself. Tillman, a literal manifestation of the idea that football players are troops, will always be uniquely useful to the league in its quest to maintain its status as an American institution. One might hope that shame or the simple passage of time would eventually compel the NFL to stop exploiting Tillman's legacy in this specific way, but today's invocation was another reminder of how unlikely that is to happen. No amount of information about who Tillman was, what he really believed, and how he really died are enough to trump everything the NFL gains from pairing images of him in his NFL and military uniforms.